He said, "Grandpa, don't go in the back room." What I found had been buried there for 12 years. The padlock was warm. Not from the summer heat, not from the afternoon sun bleeding through the farmhouse windows. Warm the way something gets when it's been held by human hands, recently, desperately, as if someone had been standing at that door just moments before I arrived. My grandson Tyler was 7 years old, and he was pulling at my sleeve with both fists, his knuckles white, his face the color of old paper. "Grandpa," he whispered, "don't go in the back room." I looked down at him. Tyler was not a fearful child. He was the boy who caught copperheads barehanded in the creek behind the old Miller property. He was the boy who climbed the water tower on a dare when he was 6 and laughed the whole way down. He was, by every measure I'd known in 71 years of living, the bravest small person I had ever encountered. And he was terrified. "Tyler," I said, keeping my voice steady the way my own grandfather had once kept his voice. Steady when the river flooded and we were sure the levee would break. "What's in the back room?" He shook his head. "Son, I need you to tell me." He shook his head again, harder this time, and pressed his face against my arm, and that was when I knew whatever was behind that door, I was going to find it with or without his blessing. Because a child that frightened doesn't walk away from, you walk toward. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I am 71 years old. I have buried a wife, outlived a son, raised a granddaughter who became a surgeon, and spent 40 years as a county sheriff in a part of rural Tennessee that most maps don't bother to name correctly. I have seen things that would make younger men sleep with the lights on. What I found in that back room on a Tuesday afternoon in late August would haunt me longer than any of them. Let me back up to the beginning, because a story like this one doesn't start the day you open the door. It starts 12 years earlier with a lie so clean and so complete that everyone who heard it believed it without question, including me. My son Robert had a farm about 40 minutes outside of Cookeville. It wasn't much, 16 acres, a house that needed more work than it ever got, a barn that leaned slightly westward like it was tired of standing up straight. Robert had bought it after his divorce from Tyler's mother, Cynthia, back when he was 42, and convinced that what he needed was land and quiet, and distance from everything that had gone wrong. I understood that impulse. I had felt it myself after Margaret died. Robert worked the land for about 3 years, kept some chickens, grew a vegetable garden the size of a parking lot, and seemed by all outward appearances to be healing when I visited. And I visited often, because Robert was the kind of man who seemed fine right up until he wasn't. I'd find him on the porch with a glass of iced tea, talking about the soil composition in the eastern field, or about the fox that kept getting into his chicken coop, or about Tyler's school reports, which were excellent despite Cynthia's decision to move to Nashville. He seemed fine. He seemed absolutely fine. And then one morning in October 12 years ago, Robert didn't answer his phone. He didn't answer it the next day either. I drove out to the farm on the 3rd day and found the house empty. The chickens scattered across the yard, the garden going to rot, and Robert's truck sitting in the driveway with the key still in the ignition. The investigating officer, a young deputy named Marsh, who I'd hired myself and who I trusted, found nothing suspicious. No signs of struggle, no blood. Robert's wallet and identification were still in the house. His clothes were still in the closet. His Bible was still on the nightstand, open to Psalms, the way he always kept it. But Robert was gone. The case went cold within 18 months. The prevailing theory, shared by Deputy Marsh and eventually accepted by almost everyone who knew Robert, was that he had simply walked away. It happened more than people wanted to admit, men in their 40s who had lost 2 Much who had built a quiet life around the edges of grief and found, one morning, that the quiet wasn't enough anymore. They left. They started over somewhere no one knew them. Sometimes they came back. More often they didn't. I did not believe it. I did not believe it because I knew my son. I knew the way he talked about Tyler, even from a distance, even through a custody arrangement that gave him every other weekend and 2 weeks in summer. I knew the way his voice changed when he mentioned the boy's name. Softer, fuller, the way a man's voice gets when he's talking about the thing he would die before abandoning. Robert would not have left Tyler. But I couldn't prove it, and grief, I have learned, has a way of eventually accepting the stories that hurt least, even when some part of you knows better. I kept the farm, paid the taxes on it from my pension, drove out every few months to check on it, to walk the land, to stand on the porch where Robert used to sit with his iced tea and try to feel some trace of him in the air. I never found anything. Until Tyler turned 7, and Cynthia decided he was old enough to spend a full summer on his grandfather's property, which by then I had started living on half the time, unwilling to sell it, unable to explain why. And until Tyler found the back room. The back room was not technically a room. It was a space beneath the house, half basement, half root cellar, accessible through a door in the kitchen floor that I had always assumed was purely for storage. Robert had mentioned it once, offhandedly, the way you mention a closet or a crawl space. There's a root cellar under the kitchen. Dad, previous owners, used it for canning, I think. I keep meaning to clean it out. He never had. After he disappeared, I'd opened the floor door once, shone a flashlight down into the darkness, seen nothing but bare earth and old wooden shelving, and the smell of damp and time, and closed it again. I had not opened it in 12 years. Tyler had been on the property for 3 weeks when I noticed the padlock. It was a heavy thing, matte black, the kind you'd use on a storage unit or a barn gate, and it was threaded through a new hasp that had been screwed into the floor door and the surrounding boards with what looked like recently set hardware. The screws were clean. The hasp was not rusted. Someone had installed it deliberately and not long ago. I had not put it there. Tyler had been watching me from the kitchen doorway. When did this get here? I asked him. He said nothing. Tyler, I looked at him directly. Did you put this lock here? No, sir. Do you know who did? A long pause, then, Grandpa, don't go in the back room. I crouched down to his level. He had Robert's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that Margaret had always called river water, and in that moment, standing in the kitchen of his dead father's house with those river water eyes full of something I couldn't name, he looked so much like Robert at 7 years old, that I had to steady my breathing before I could speak. Tyler, I need you to tell me what you know. I can't. Why not? His jaw worked, his hands curled at his sides, because he said not to. The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, a crow called once and went silent. Who said not to? I asked, though I already knew, the way you sometimes know things before they're confirmed. The way the body understands what the mind isn't ready to accept. Tyler pressed his lips together. Son, I said, my voice was not quite steady anymore. Who told you not to let anyone in the back room? Tyler looked at the floor door, then he looked at me. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was holding it back with everything he had, the way a brave child holds things back when they've been told to. My dad, he whispered. I will not pretend that what happened next was orderly. It was not. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Simply sat down, because my legs had made that decision without consulting me, and I stayed there for what was probably 3 minutes but felt like considerably longer, while Tyler stood in the doorway and watched me with those wet, careful eyes. Robert, 12 years. 12 years of cold case files and unanswered questions, and standing on a porch talking to the air. 12 years of a grave I couldn't visit because there was no grave, of a grief that couldn't fully close because the story had never ended. And my son had spoken to his boy. When I could stand again, I did. I looked at Tyler and I said, "When did you talk to your father?" "Before Mom brought me here for the summer," he said. "He called. He said I might be coming to the farm and that if Grandpa ever tried to open the back room, I should tell him not to." He swallowed. He said it was important. "Did he say why?" "He said you'd understand when you saw it." I looked at the padlock. "Do you have the key?" I asked. Tyler reached into the pocket of his jeans and produced a small brass key on a plain ring. He held it out to me on his palm, his hand steady, the way you hand something over when you've been waiting a long time to be relieved of it. I took the key. "Go outside," I told him. "Go sit on the porch and don't come back in until I call you." "Is my dad okay?" he asked. I didn't answer because I didn't know, and I was not going to lie to him. He went to the porch. I opened the lock. The smell hit me first, not rot, not damp, but something chemical and preserving like cedar. An old paper and something else I couldn't immediately identify. I pulled the floor door up and held my flashlight over the opening and looked down. The root cellar was not what I had seen 12 years ago. Someone had been living in it. Not recently. There was a fine coating of dust over everything, but extensively, carefully. Deliberately, a cot along one wall, military style, with a folded wool blanket at the foot. A camp stove, 3 5-gallon water jugs empty, shelving that had been reorganized and stocked not with canning jars but with books, notebooks, a battery-powered lantern, a shortwave radio that looked functional, and enough non-perishable food for several months. And in the center of the space, on a small wooden table that had not been there 12 years ago, a box. A metal document box, the fireproof kind, with a combination lock set to 0. I climbed down the ladder. The space was larger than I'd realized, maybe 15 by 12 feet, with enough headroom to stand almost fully upright if you were shorter than 6 feet. Someone had strung wire along the ceiling for additional lighting, though the bulbs were dead. The cot had been made and remade so many times that the blanket's folds had a practiced precision to them, the kind that comes from years of habit. Years. Not weeks, not months. Years. I sat on the cot, and I looked at the box, and I breathed for a moment. Then I opened it. The combination was Tyler's birthday. I tried it on instinct, month, day, year, and the lock clicked open on the first attempt. Inside was a letter. 12 pages, handwritten, in Robert's distinctive blocky print, and beneath the letter a set of documents that I needed several minutes to fully understand, photographs, photocopied records, a USB drive, and a folded legal instrument that turned out to be a sworn affidavit. Notarized, dated 8 months after Robert's disappearance. I read the letter first, Dad. If you're reading this, then Tyler found a way to get you here, which means he trusted you enough to give you the key, which means I was right about him. He's going to be okay. I've always known that, but it's good to have confirmation. I need you to understand that what I'm going to tell you is going to make you angry. You're going to want to find me and have a version of the conversation we used to have when I was 17 and doing things I shouldn't have been doing. I'm asking you before you read further to get to the end of this letter before you make any decisions. I know that's hard for you. I know you've spent 12 years making decisions without complete information, and I know how much that has cost you. I'm sorry for that, more than I can put in a letter. Here is what happened. About 6 months before I disappeared, I found something on this property. I was digging out a drainage trench along the east fence line. You remember that section that always floods in spring, and I hit something about 3 feet down. I thought it was a root or a rock. It was a box similar to this one but older and not locked. Inside the box were records. I'm going to give you the short version first, and then the documents will give you the long version. The short version is this. The man who owned this farm before me, a man named Carol Pruitt, was not what he appeared to be. He appeared to be a retired county administrator who'd lived quietly on this land for 30 years before selling it and moving to Florida. What he actually was, based on what I found in that box, was a man who had been embezzling funds from a county infrastructure account for almost 2 decades. Not small amounts, Dad. We're talking about a number with 7 figures in it, and who had been doing it with the help of 3 other men, 2 of whom were still very much active in county government when I found those records. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I should have come to you immediately. I should have. I didn't, because one of the 3 men was connected to your department in a way that made me uncertain about who I could trust, and because I was, frankly, scared in a way I'd never been scared before. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. What I did instead was wrong. I contacted one of them directly. I told him what I had. I told him I wanted to know what had happened, and that I wasn't going to do anything with the records if he could explain it to me. I thought, and this was naive, Dad, I know it was naive, that there might be an explanation, that I might have misunderstood something. There was no explanation. What happened instead was that 2 men I didn't recognize came to the farm 3 days later. They didn't hurt me. They told me very clearly what would happen to Tyler if I went to any authority with what I had found. They were specific about it. They knew where Cynthia lived. They knew Tyler's school. They knew his schedule. So I ran. I know. I took the original documents. I made copies. I buried the copies in this cellar and I ran. I have been moving around for 12 years. I am not going to tell you where I am in this letter, because if this letter were found by the wrong person, I don't want my location in it, but I am safe. I am alive, and I have spent 12 years building a case, not just against those 3 men, but against the entire network they were part of, because it turned out that Carol Pruitt's little county embezzlement operation was the smallest part of something much larger, and the people at the top of it have resources that made me understand very clearly why I couldn't come home. The USB drive contains everything. 12 years of documentation, dates, accounts, names, transactions, photographs. There is enough on that drive to put 11 people in federal prison. And I have already been in contact with a federal prosecutor in Nashville, not through the county, not through state, federal, who is expecting either me or you to deliver it. Her name is on the drive. She will know what it means when you call. Dad, I need you to understand something. I left because staying would have gotten Tyler killed. Every day of the last 12 years I have weighed that decision, every single day, and every day I have come to the same conclusion, which is that Tyler alive and missing his father is a better outcome than Tyler dead. He doesn't know the details. He knows I'm alive and that I had to go away and that it wasn't his fault. I've made sure he knows that. I've called him when I could, carefully, briefly, in ways that couldn't be traced. I don't know what it's done to him, and I don't know if he'll forgive me, and I've had to make peace with both of those possibilities. But he's alive, and so am I. And if you're reading this, something has shifted. Either the case is ready to move, or circumstances have changed, or I've decided it's time to stop running. By the time you find this, I'll have made contact with the prosecutor. The wheels will already be turning. Call the number on the drive, Dad. And then come find me. I'm ready to come home. Robert. I sat in that root cellar for a long time. Above me, through the kitchen floor, through the walls of the farmhouse, through the August heat, I could hear Tyler on the porch. I could hear him moving, the creak of the old porch swing, the scuff of his sneakers on the wood, and the sound of him, alive and present and 7 years old and waiting, was the thing that finally made me stop just breathing and start thinking clearly. I looked at the USB drive. I looked at the documents. And I picked up my phone and called a number I hadn't used in 3 years, an old contact at the FBI field office in Nashville, a woman named Patricia Chen who had worked a case with our department back in my last year as sheriff, and who I trusted more than almost anyone I could think of in a moment like this one. She answered on the second ring. Daniel Hargrove, she said. It's been a long time. Patricia, I said, I need to tell you something, and then I need you to tell me who I should call. I told her everything. I talked for 22 minutes without stopping, and Patricia Chen, to her considerable credit, did not interrupt me once. When I finished, there was a brief silence. The prosecutor Robert mentioned, she said, is her name on the drive? I haven't looked at the drive yet. I only just finished the letter. Look at the drive. If the name is Sarah Ellison, then your son has been talking to someone I know personally, and that means this is further along than you realize. A pause. Daniel, if that name is on there, this thing is already moving. Your son may have timed this deliberately. My hands were not steady as I opened the drive's document folder on my phone. The first file was labeled Contact. I opened it. Sarah Ellison, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Middle District of Tennessee, a phone number, and a single line beneath it. Tell her Daniel Hargrove is calling. She'll know what to do. I read that line twice. Patricia, I said. Is it her? It's her. Another pause, longer this time. Daniel, Patricia said quietly, your son has been coordinating with a federal prosecutor for at least the last year. That doesn't happen unless the case is solid and the timing is intentional. Something is about to break open. I looked at the cot, at the folded blanket, at the years of careful, quiet preparation laid out around me in a root cellar under a farmhouse where my son had once planned to rebuild his life. He said he's ready to come home, I told her. Then let's bring him home, she said. I will not give you the full accounting of what happened over the following 6 weeks because some of it is still part of an active federal case, and because some of it is simply not mine to tell. I will tell you the parts that belong to me. I called Sarah Ellison within the hour. She was expecting my call. Robert had told her it was coming, though not the exact timing. She was composed, professional, and thorough, and she told me, with the careful, measured language of a federal prosecutor who has spent years saying the right words in exactly the right order, that the investigation was significantly advanced, that several of the subjects were already under surveillance, and that Robert's 12 years of documentation had been the cornerstone of a case that was, in her words, the most comprehensively evidenced municipal corruption prosecution she had seen in 20 years of practice. She also told me that Robert was safe. She told me he had been in protective custody for 6 weeks, voluntary, cooperative, preparing for testimony. She told me he was in Nashville. She told me he had been asking every single day when he could talk to his father. I drove to Nashville that evening. I will not try to describe the hour I spent with my son in a federal facility's family meeting room, because that hour belongs to us and to no one else. I will say only that he was 54 years old and looked it, and that he had his mother's stubborn jaw and my own gray at his temples, and that we sat across a table from each other for the first 5 minutes without saying anything. at all, and that it was enough. It was more than enough. Tyler did not come that first night. Cynthia was called. The situation was explained to her in the careful, incomplete way that these situations get explained, and it was agreed that Tyler would see his father when circumstances allowed for more stability. That happened 3 weeks later, in a different room, and I was there for it, and I will carry that image: Tyler crossing a room at a dead run and Robert catching him, and neither of them speaking for a very long time for whatever years I have left. The indictments came down on a Thursday morning in late October. 11 people, county administrators, a former state official, 2 private contractors, and this was the part that hit me personally, the part that explained Robert's hesitation about coming to me, a former deputy from my own department, who had left the job 4 years after Robert's disappearance, under circumstances that I had never fully understood. I had hired that man, I had trusted him. I spent a difficult evening with that knowledge before I was able to set it down. Carol Pruitt died in Florida in the 3rd year of Robert's disappearance, which meant he faced no charges, but the men who had threatened Robert, the 2 who had come to the farm, who had named Tyler's school and his schedule, were among those indicted, and the federal prosecutor made clear that the threat against a child would be a significant factor at sentencing. The farm is still standing. Robert came back to it in November, after the initial court proceedings had established enough structure that his physical safety was no longer a daily calculation. He walked the 16 acres on a cold morning with Tyler beside him, pointing out the places that had changed and the places that hadn't, and I followed behind them at a distance, letting them have it. The east fence line, where Robert had dug the drainage trench and found a buried box and had the course of his life permanently altered. He stopped there for a long time. Tyler stood beside him and said nothing. Then Tyler put his hand in his father's hand, and they stood there together in the cold, and the field just sat there being a field, indifferent and beautiful and completely, mercifully ordinary. That evening, the 3 of us sat on the porch as the temperature dropped and the stars came out over the Tennessee hills, and Tyler, who had kept a secret for an entire summer with the self-possession of someone 3 times his age, leaned against his father's arm and said, "Dad, I didn't tell Grandpa, just like you said." Robert looked at me over the top of Tyler's head. "You kept that promise a long time," I said to Tyler. He shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a child who is very proud of himself. "It wasn't that hard." It was, in fact, extraordinarily hard. He told me later, much later, when he was old enough to talk about it plainly, that he had almost broken 6 times over the course of that summer. That the hardest moment had been when I'd first noticed the padlock, and he'd seen the expression on my face, the recognition, the hope, the something I didn't dare name, and had nearly told me everything right then. But he hadn't, because his father had asked him not to, and because Tyler understood even at 7 that sometimes the people you love ask things of you that are hard, and that love means doing them anyway, even when it costs you. I think about the warmth of that padlock sometimes. I've decided it was the summer heat after all. It must have been. There's no other explanation. That makes sense. But some mornings, when I'm on that porch with my coffee and the light is coming up over the east field and I can hear Tyler and Robert somewhere inside the house, arguing about something, laughing about something, being ordinary and present and alive, I let myself think that maybe it was something else. Maybe it was 12 years of hopping, concentrated in a small brass lock on a door. Maybe it was a man who had run as far as he could and was finally ready to stop. My son came home. That is the whole story. That is enough. Daniel Hargrove, age 71, Cookeville, Tennessee.